ہسٹری کیا ہے، واٹ از ہسٹری، یہ ایک ڈبیٹ ہے ہسٹوریوگرافی میں. ڈیفائن کرنے کی کوشش کی ہے اس کو مختلف انداز سے. اور جو میں اب چیپٹر آپ کے لیے پڑھوں گا، کیت جینکنس کی کتاب ہے ری تھنکنگ ہسٹری، اس میں سے. تو اس میں ایک چیز میں تھوڑی سی ایک انڈیکیٹ کرنا چاہوں گا کہ یہ جو یہ ہسٹری پہ اس طرح تبصرہ کیا گیا ہے، یہ ایک پوسٹ ماڈرنسٹ اپروچ ہے. پوسٹ ماڈرنسٹ اپروچ جنرلی جن لوگوں کو زیادہ اس کے بارے میں علم نہیں ہے، میں ذرا مختصراً یہ بیان کر دوں کہ پوسٹ ماڈرنزم یہ دو 20ویں صدی میں اپروچز رہی ہیں، آرٹ میں، لٹریچر میں، سوشل سائنسز میں. تو پوسٹ ماڈرن اپروچ جو ہے، جو کہ دوسری جنگ عظیم کے بعد کے دور میں فلوسافیکل اپروچ اگر آپ کہنا چاہتے ہیں اسے، جس میں ہر سیٹلڈ میٹر کو، یعنی جو وہ موضوعات جنہیں یہ سمجھا گیا کہ یہ اب طے ہو چکے ہیں، ان کو دوبارہ ٹیک اپ کیا گیا اور اس کو اس انداز سے دیکھا گیا کہ یہ موضوعات جو ہیں وہ سیٹلڈ نہیں ہیں، ابھی طے نہیں ہوئے ہیں، اس پہ مزید ڈیبیٹ کی گنجائش ہے. تو اس کو ایک اسکیپٹسزم یا ہر معاملے پہ ایک سوالیہ نشان کے طور پہ بھی دیکھا جاتا ہے. اور سوچ میں یہ رہا ہوں کہ مختلف رائٹرز ہیں جنہوں نے اسی موضوع پہ گفتگو کی ہے، ان سب کو میں آپ کے سامنے پیش کروں. تو پھر جب آپ لوگ جتنے بھی اس میں لیڈنگ وائسز ہیں، جب آپ ان کو سن لیں گے تو آپ کو اب میرے خیال ہے ایک بہتر پوزیشن میں ہوں گے اس سوال کا جواب دینے کے لیے کہ تاریخ کو کیسے دیکھا جانا چاہیے. کہ یہ اس حوالے سے اہم بات ہے کہ اس وقت بہت ساری ہسٹری جو ہے وہ ہمارے سامنے آتی ہے. دنیا کے بہت سے اکثر تنازعات وہ اسی بحث سے جنم لیتے ہیں کہ تاریخ کا کون سا ورژن یا اس کا جو ہے وہ زیادہ کریڈیبل ہے، ریلائبل ہے، بچوں کو کیا پڑھانا چاہیے. اور ایک بہت ابھی کامن فریز جو استعمال ہوتا رہا ہمارے میڈیا میں، نیریٹو کیا ہونا چاہیے. تو یہ سب چیزیں جو ہیں وہ اسی موضوع سے جنم لیتی ہیں. تو اس لیے میرا خیال تھا کہ اسے سمجھنا ضروری ہے. جن لوگوں کی سیاست میں دلچسپی ہے یا تاریخ میں دلچسپی ہے، تو آئی تھنک اٹ ول بی اے گڈ وے ٹو اسٹارٹ تھنکنگ اینڈ ٹاکنگ اباؤٹ history and politics. So, Keith Jenkins, what is history? In this chapter, I want to try and answer the question, what is history? To do this, I will look initially at what history is in theory, secondly, examine what it is in practice, and finally, put theory and practice together into a definition. A methodologically informed, skeptical, ironic definition that I hope is comprehensive enough to give you a reasonable grip not only on the history question, but also on some of the debates and positions that surround it. On theory. At the level of theory, I would like to make 2 points. The first, which I will outline in this paragraph and then develop, is that history is one of a series of discourses about the world. These discourses do not create the world, that physical stuff on which we apparently live, but they do appropriate it and give it all the meanings it has. That bit of the world which is history's ostensible object of inquiry is the past. History as discourse is thus in a different category to that which it discourses about. That is, the past and history are different things. Additionally, the past and history are not stitched into each other such that only one historical reading of the past is absolutely necessary. The past and history float free of each other. They are ages and miles apart. For the same object of inquiry can be read differently by different discursive practices. A landscape can be read, interpreted differently by geographers, sociologists, historians, artists, economists, etc. Whilst internal to each, there are different interpretive readings over time and space. As far as history is concerned, historiography shows this. The above paragraph is not an easy one. I have made a lot of statements, but all of them revolve actually around the distinction between the past and history. This distinction is therefore crucial for you to understand. For if it is appreciated, then it and the debate it gives rise to will help to clarify what history is in theory. Accordingly, I will examine the points I have just made by looking in some detail at the past history difference, and then by considering some of the main consequences arising from it. Let me begin with the idea that history is a discourse about, but categorically different from, the past. This might strike you as odd, for you may have missed this distinction before, or if not, you may still not have bothered too much about it. One of the reasons why this is so, why the distinction is generally left unworked, is because as English speakers we tend to lose sight of the fact that there actually is this distinction between history as that which has been written, recorded about the past, and the past itself, because the word history covers both things. It would be preferable, therefore, always to register this difference by using the term the past for all that has gone on before everywhere, whilst using the word historiography for history. Historiography referring here to the writings of historians. This would be good practice. The past as the object of the historian's attention, historiography as the way historians attend to it, leaving the word history with a capital H, to refer to the whole ensemble of relations. However, habit might be hard to break, and I might myself use the word history to refer to the past, to historiography, and to the totality of relationships. But remember, if and when I do, I keep the said distinction in mind, and you should too. It may well be, however, that this clarification on the past history distinction seems inconsequential, that one is left thinking, so what? What does it matter? Let me offer three illustrations of why the past history distinction is important to understand. Number one, the past has occurred. It has gone and can only be brought back again by historians in very different media. For example, in books, articles, documentaries, etc., not as actual events. The past has gone, and history is what historians make of it when they go to work. History is the labor of historians and or those acting as if they were historians, and when they meet, one of the first questions they ask each other is what they are working on. It is this work, embodied in books, periodicals, etc., that you read when you do history. I am going to university to read history. What this means is that history is quite literally on library and other shelves. Thus, if you start a course on 17th century Spain, you do not actually go to the 17th century or to Spain. You go, with the help of your reading list, to the library. This is where 17th century Spain is, between Dewey numbers, for where else do teachers send you in order to read it up? Of course, You could go to other places where you can find other traces of the past, for example, Spanish archives. But wherever you go, when you get there, you will have to read. This reading is not spontaneous or natural, but learned on various courses, for example, and informed, made meaningful by other texts. History, historiography is an intertextual linguistic construct. Number two, let us say that you have been studying part of England's past, the 16th century, at A level. Let us imagine that you have used one major textbook, Elton's England under the Tudors. In class, you have discussed aspects of the 16th century, you have class notes, but for your essays and the bulk of your revision, you have used Elton. When the exam came along, you wrote in the shadow of Elton. And when you passed, you gained an A level in English history, a qualification for considering aspects of the past. But really, it would be more accurate to say you have an A level in Geoffrey Elton. For what? Actually, at this stage is your reading of the English past, if not basically his reading of it. Number three. These two brief examples of the past history distinction may seem innocuous, but actually it can have enormous effects. For example, although millions of women have lived in the past in Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, Africa, America, few of them appear in history, that is, in history texts. Women, to use a phrase, have been hidden from history, that is, systematically excluded from most historians' accounts. Accordingly, feminists are now engaged in the task of writing women back into history, whilst both men and women are looking at the interconnected constructions of masculinity. And at this point, you might pause to consider how many other groups, peoples, classes have been are omitted from histories and why, and what might be the consequences if such omitted groups were central to historical accounts and the now central groups were marginalized. More will be said about the significance and possibilities of working the past history distinction later, but I would now like to look at another argument from the earlier paragraph where I said that we have to understand that the past and history are not stitched into each other, such that one and only one reading of any phenomenon is entailed, that the same object of inquiry is capable of being read differently by different discourses, whilst internal to each there are different readings over space and time. To begin to illustrate this, let us imagine that through a window we can see a landscape, though not all of it, because the window frame quite literally frames it. We can see in the foreground several roads. Beyond, we can see other roads with houses alongside. We can see rolling fields with farmhouses in them on the skyline. Some miles away, we can see ridges of hills. In the middle distance, we can see a market town. The sky is a watery blue. Now, there is nothing in this landscape that says geography, yet clearly a geographer could account for it geographically. Thus, he might read the land as displaying specific field patterns and farming practices. The roads could become part of a series of local, regional communication networks. The farms and town could be read in terms of a specific population distribution. Contour maps could chart the terrain. Climatic geographers could explain the climate, weather, and say consequent types of irrigation. In this way, the view could become something else, geography. Similarly, A sociologist could make the same landscape and construct it sociologically. People in the town could become data for occupational structures, size of family units, etc. Income, population distribution could be considered in terms of class, income, age, sex. Climate could be seen as affecting leisure facilities and so on. Historians, too, can turn the same landscape into their discourse. Field patterns today could be compared to those pre enclosures. Population now to that of 1831, 1871. Land ownership and political power analyzed over time. One could examine how a bit of the view edges into a national park, of when and why the railway and canal ceased functioning, and so on. Now, given that there is nothing intrinsic in the view that shouts geography, sociology, history, etc., then we can see clearly that whilst historians and the rest of them do not invent the view that all stuff seems to be there all right, they do invent all its descriptive categories and any meanings it can be said to have. They construct the analytical and methodological tools to make out of this raw material their ways of reading and talking about it. Discoursing. In that sense, we read the world as a text, and logically, such readings are infinite. By which I do not mean that we just make up stories about the world, the past. That is, that we know the world, the past, and then make up stories about them. But rather, the claim is a much stronger one, and that we cannot get out of these stories, narratives, to check if they correspond to the real world past, because these always already narratives constitute reality, which means, in the example being discussed, that landscape, which only becomes meaningful as a reading, cannot fix such readings once and for all, and thus, geographers may interpret and reinterpret, read and reread the landscape endlessly whilst arguing about just what is being said here geographically. Additionally, given that geography as a discourse has not always existed, then not only have geographers' reading had to begin, and not only have they differed over space and time, but geographers have themselves understood, read what constitutes the discourse they are working within differently too. That is, geography itself as a way of reading the world needs interpreting, historicizing. And so it is with sociology and history. Different sociologists and historians interpret the same phenomenon differently through discourses that are always on the move, that are always being decomposed and recomposed, are always positioned and positioning, and which thus need constant self examination at discourses by those who use them. At this point, then, let me assume that the argument that history as a discourse is categorically different to the past has been indicated. I said at the start of the chapter, however, that at the level of theory vis a vis what is history, I would be making 2 points. Here is the second. Given the past history distinction, the problem for the historians who somehow wants to capture the past within his/her history thus becomes, how do you fit these two things together? Obviously, how this connection is attempted, how the historian tries to know the past, is crucial in determining the possibilities of what history is and can be, not least because it is history's claim to knowledge rather than belief or assertion that makes it the discourse it is. I mean, historians do not usually see themselves as writers of fiction, although inadvertently they may be. Yet, because of the past history difference and because the object of inquiry that historians work on is, in most of its manifestations, actually absent in that only traces of the past remain, then clearly there are all kinds of limits controlling the knowledge claims that historians can make. And for me, in this fitting together of past history, there are three very problematic theoretical areas of epistemology, methodology, and ideology, each of which must be discussed if we are to see what history is. Epistemology, from the Greek episteme, knowledge, refers to the philosophical area of theories of knowledge. In that sense, history is part of another discourse, philosophy, taking part in general question of what it is possible to know with reference to its own area of knowledge, the past. And here you might see the problem already. For if it is hard to know about something that exists, to say something about an effectively absent subject like the past in history is especially difficult. It seems obvious that all such knowledge is therefore likely to be tentative and constructed by historians working under all kinds of presuppositions and pressures, which did not, of course, operate on people in the past. Yet we still see historians trying to raise before us the specter of the real past, an objective past about which their accounts are accurate and even true. Now I think such certainist claims are not and never were possible to achieve. And I would say that in our current situation, this ought to be obvious, as I will argue in chapter 3. Yet to accept this, to allow doubt to run, clearly affects what you might think history is. That is, it gives you part of the answer to what history is and can be. For to admit not really to know, to see history as being logically anything you want it to be, the fact value distinction allows this. Besides, there have been so very many histories, poses the question of how specific histories come to be constructed into one shape rather than another, not only etymologically, but methodologically and ideologically too. Here, what can be known and how we can know interact with power. Yet, in a sense, this is so, and this point must be stressed. Only because of history's epistemological fragility. For if it were possible to know once and for all, now and forever, then there would be no need for any more history to be written. For what would be the point of countless historians saying it all over again in the same way? History, historical constructions, not the past future, would stop. And if you think that the idea of stopping history, historians, is absurd, it really isn't. Stopping history is not only part of Orwell's 1984, for example, but a part of European experience in the 1930s, the more immediate time and place that made Orwell consider it. Epistemological fragility then allows for historians' readings to be multifarious, one past, many histories. So, what is it that makes history so epistemologically fragile? There are four basic reasons. First, and in what follows, I draw on David Loventhal's arguments in his The Past is a Foreign Country. No historian can cover and thus recover the totality of past events because their Content is virtually limitless. One cannot recount more than a fraction of what has occurred, and no historian's account ever corresponds precisely with the past. The sheer bulk of the past precludes total history. Most information about the past has never been recorded, and most of the rest was evanescent. Second, no account can recover the past as it was because the past was not an account but events, situations, etc. As the past has gone, no account can ever be checked against it, but only against other accounts. We judge the accuracy of historians' accounts vis-a-vis other historians' interpretations, and there is no real account, no proper history that, deep down, allows us to check all other accounts against it. There is no fundamentally correct text of which other interpretations are just variations. Variations are all there are. Here, the cultural critic Stephen Giles is succinct when he comments that what has gone before is always apprehended through the sedimented layers of previous interpretations and through the reading habits and categories developed by previous current interpretive discourses. And this insight allows us to make the point that this way of seeing things makes the study of history, the past, necessarily a study of historiography, historians. Historiography, therefore, being considered not as an extra to the study of history, but as actually constituting it. This is an area I shall return to in chapter 2, but now to the third point. And this is that no matter how verifiable, how widely acceptable or checkable, history remains inevitably a personal construct, a manifestation of the historian's perspective as a narrator, unlike direct memory itself suspect. History relies on someone else's eyes and voice. We see through an interpreter who stands between past events and our readings of them. Of course, as Lowenthal says, written history in practice cuts down the historian's logical freedom to write anything but allowing the reader access to his/her sources. But the historian's viewpoint and predilections still shape the choice of historical materials, and our own personal constructs determine what we make of them. The past that we know is always contingent upon our own views, our own present, just as we are ourselves products of the past. So the known past, history, is an artifact of ours. Nobody, however immersed in the past, can divest himself, herself of his/her knowledge and assumptions. To explain the past, Lowenthal notes historians go beyond the actual record to frame hypotheses in present day modes of thought. We are moderns, and our words and thought cannot but be modern, noted Maitland. It is too late for us to be early English. There are, then, few limits to the shaping power of interpreter, imagining words. Look, says the poet Felibinikov in his Decrees to the Planets, the sun obeys my syntax. Look, says the historian, the past obeys my interpretation. Now, this might look slightly poetical itself. To the so the point being made about sources at one and the same time, preventing the historian's total freedom and yet not fixing things such that they can really stop endless interpretations, might be illustrated by a mundane example. Thus, there are many disagreements as to Hitler's intentions after gaining power and the causes of the Second World War. One such famous, long running disagreement has been between A. J. P. Taylor and H. Trevor Roper. This disagreement was not based on their merits as historians. Both are very experienced, both have skills, both can read documents, and in this case, they often read the same ones. Yet, still they disagreed. Thus, whilst the sources may prevent just anything at all from being said, nevertheless, the same events, sources do not entail that one and only one reading has to follow. The above three reasons for epistemological fragility are based on the idea that history is less than the past, that the historians can only recover fragments. But the fourth point stresses that, through hindsight, we in a way know more about the past than the people who lived in it. In translating the past into modern terms and in using knowledge perhaps previously unavailable, the historian discovers both what has been forgotten about the past and pieces together things never pieced together before. People and social formations are thus caught up in processes that can only be seen in retrospect. Documents and other traces are ripped out of their original context of purpose and function to illustrate, say, a pattern which might not be remotely meaningful to any of their authors. And all this is, as Loventhal says, inevitable. History always conflates, it changes, it exaggerates aspects of the past. Time is foreshortened, details selected and highlighted, action concentrated, relations simplified, not to deliberately alter the events but to give them meaning. Even the most empirical chronicler has to invent narrative structures to give shape to time and place. Yes, Geste may well be one damned thing after another, but it cannot possibly appear as such, for all meaning would then be extruded from it. And because stories emphasize linkages and play down the role of breaks, of ruptures, then concludes Loventhal, histories as known to us appear more comprehensible than we have any reason to believe the past was. These then are the main and well known epistemological limits. I have drawn them quickly and impressionistically, and you might go on to read Loventhal and this and the other yourself. But now I intend to move on, for if these are the epistemological limits to what can be known, then they obviously interconnect with the ways historians try and find out as much as they can. And with historians' methods, as with epistemology, there are no definitive ways that have to be used by virtue of their being correct. Historians' methods are every bit as fragile as their epistemology. So far, I have argued that history is a shifting discourse constructed by historians, and that from the existence of the past, no one reading is entailed. Change the gaze, shift the perspective, and new readings appear. Yet, although historians know all this, most seem to studiously ignore it and strive for objectivity and truth nevertheless. And this striving for truth cuts through ideological, methodological positions. Thus, on the empirical right, somewhat, G. Elton, in The Practice of History, states at the start of his chapter on research: the study of history then amounts to a search for the truth. And although the same chapter ends with a series of qualifications, he, the historian, knows that what he is studying is real, but he knows that he can never recover all of it. He knows that the process of historical research and reconstruction will never end, but he is also conscious that this does not render his work unreal or illegitimate. It is obvious that such caveats do not seriously affect Elton's originally stated truth search. On the Marxist left, somewhat, E.P. Thompson, in The Poverty of Theory, writes that for some time, the materialist conception of history has been growing in self confidence. As a mature practice, it is perhaps the strongest discipline deriving from the Marxist tradition. Even in my own lifetime, the advances have been considerable, and one had supposed these to be advances in knowledge. Thompson admits that this is not to say that such knowledge is subject to scientific proof, but he holds it to be real knowledge nevertheless. In the empirical center, somewhat, A. Marwick, in The Nature of History, appreciates what he calls the subjective dimension of historians' account. But for him, this doesn't live in, say, the historian's ideological position, but in the nature of the evidence, historians being forced into a greater display of personal interpretation by the imperfections of their source materials. This being the case, Marwick thus argues that it is the job of the historians to develop tight methodological rules whereby they can reduce their moral interventions. Thus, Marwick links up to Elton. Elton is keen to establish that just because historical explanation does not depend upon universal laws, that does not mean it is not governed by very strict rules. And so, for all these historians, truth, knowledge, and legitimacy derive from tight methodological rules and procedures. It is this that cuts down interpretive flux. My argument is different. For me, what determines interpretation ultimately lies beyond method and evidence in ideology. For while most historians would agree that a rigorous method is important, there is a problem as to which rigorous method they are talking about. In Marwick's own section on method, he reviews a selection from which one can presumably choose. Thus, would you like to follow Hegel or Marx or Dilthey or Weber or Popper or Hampel or Aaron or Collingwood or Gray or Oakeshott or Dante or Gelly or Welch or Atkinson or Leff or Hexter? Would you care to go along with modern empiricists, feminists, the analyst school, neo-Marxists, neo-stylists, econometricians, structuralists, or post-structuralists, or even Marwick himself, to name but 25 possibilities? And this is a short list. The point is that even if you could make a choice, what would be the criteria? How could you know which method would lead to the truer past? Of course, each method would be rigorous, that is, internally coherent and consistent, but it would also be self referencing. That is, it might tell you how to construct valid arguments within itself, but given that all the choices do this, then the problem of discriminating somehow between 25 alternatives just will not go away. Thompson is rigorous, and so is Elton. On what ground does one choose? On Marwick's, but why his? So, is it not likely that in the end one chooses, say, Thompson, because one just likes what Thompson does with his method? One likes his reason for doing history. And for all other things being equal, why else might one take up a position? To summarize, talk of method as the road to truth is misleading. There is a range of methods without any agreed criteria for choosing. Often people like Marwick argue that despite all the methodological differences between, say, empiricists and structuralists, They do nevertheless agree on the fundamentals. But this, again, is not so. The fact that structuralists go to enormous lengths to explain very precisely that they are not empiricists, the fact that they invented their specific approaches precisely to differentiate themselves from everyone else seems to have been a point somewhat ignored by Marwick and the others. I want now to deal briefly with just one further argument regarding method, which regularly occurs in introductory debates about the nature of history. It is about concepts, and it runs as follows. It may well be that the differences between methods cannot be closed down, but are there not key concepts that all historians use? Doesn't this imply some common methodological ground? Now, it is certainly the case that in all types of histories, one constantly meets so called historical concepts. By not calling them historians concepts, such concepts look impersonal and objective, and though they belong to a history that is somehow self generating. Not only that, such concepts are referred to quite regularly as the heartlands of history. These are concepts such as time, evidence, empathy, cause and effect, continuity and chain, and so on. I am not going to argue that you should not work concepts, but I am concerned that when presenting these particular ones, the impression is strongly given that they are indeed obvious and timeless, and that they do constitute the universal building blocks of historical knowledge. Yet, this is ironic. For one of the things that the opening up of history ought to have done is to historicize history itself, to see all historical accounts as imprisoned in time and space, and thus to see their concepts not as universal heartlands, but as specific local expressions. This historicization is easy to demonstrate in the case of common concepts. In an article on new developments in history, the educational Donald Steele has considered how certain concepts became heartland concepts, showing how in the 1960s, five major concepts were identified as constituting history: time, space, sequence, moral judgment, and social realism. Steele points out that these were refined, not least by himself, by 1970 to provide the key concepts of history: time, evidence, cause and effect, continuity, and change, and similarity and difference. Steele explains that it was these that became the basis for Schools Council history, the GCSE, certain A level developments, and which have been influential both in undergraduate courses and more generally. Apparently, then these old heartlands have been pumping away for less than 20 years, are not universal, and do not come out of historians' methods as such, but very much out of general educational thinking. Obviously, they are ideological too. For what might happen if other concepts were used to organize the dominant field? Structure agency, overdetermination, conjuncture, uneven development, center periphery, dominant marginal, base superstructure, rupture, genealogy, mentalite, hegemony, elite, paradigm, etc. It is time to address ideology directly. Let me begin with an example. Would be possible at this point in space and time to place in any school or undergraduate history syllabus a course that would be quite properly historical, in that It looked like other histories, but in which the choice of subject matter and the methodological approach was made from a black Marxist feminist perspective. Yet I doubt if any such course could be found. Why not? Not because it would not be history, for it would, but because black Marxist feminists don't really have the power to put such a course into this sort of public circulation. Yet, if one were to ask those who might well have the power to decide what does constitute suitable courses, who might well have the power to effect such inclusions, exclusions, then it is likely that they would argue that the reason for such a non appearance is because such a course would be ideological. That is, that the motives for such a history would come from concerns external to history per se, that it would be a vehicle for the delivery of a specific position for persuasive purposes. Now, this distinction between history as such and ideological history is interesting because it implies, and is meant to imply, that certain histories, generally the dominant ones, are not ideological at all, do not position people, and do not deliver views of the past that come from outside the subject. But we have already seen that meanings given to histories of all descriptions are necessarily that, not meanings intrinsic in the past, any more than the landscape had our meanings already in it before we put them there, but meanings given to the past from outside. History is never for itself, it is always for someone. Accordingly, it seems plausible to say that particular social formations want their historians to deliver particular things. It also seems plausible to say that the predominantly delivered positions will be in the interests of those stronger ruling blocs within social formations, not that such positions are automatically achieved, unchallenged, or secured once and for all, and that is it. The fact that history per se is an ideological construct means that it is constantly being reworked and reordered by all those who are variously affected by power relationships, because the dominated as well as the dominant also have their versions of past to legitimate their practices, versions which have to be excluded as improper from any place on the agenda of the dominant discourse. In that sense, reordering of the message to be delivered. Often, many such reorderings are referred to academically as controversies, just have to be constructed continuously because the needs of the dominant subordinate are constantly being reworked in the real world as they seek to mobilize peoples in support of their interests. History is forged in such conflict, and clearly these conflicting needs for history impinge upon the debates, struggle for ownership as to what history is. So, at this point, can we not see that the way to answer the question of what is history in ways that are realistic is to substitute the word who for what and add for to the end of the phrase? Thus, the question becomes not what is history, but who is history for? If we do this, then we can see that history is bound to be problematic because it is a contested term, discourse, meaning different things to different groups. For some groups want a sanitized history where conflict and distress are absent. Some want history to lead to quietism. Some want history to embody rugged individualism. Some to provide strategies and tactics for revolution. Some to provide grounds for counter revolution, and so on. It is easy to see how history for a revolutionary is bound to be different from that desired by a conservative. It is also easy to see how the list of uses for history is not only logically but practically endless. I mean, what would a history be like that everyone could once and for all agree on? Let me briefly clarify these comments with an illustration. In his novel 1984, Orwell wrote that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. This seems likely outside fiction too. Thus, peoples in the present need antecedents to locate themselves now and legitimate their ongoing and future ways of living. Actually, of course, the facts of the past or anything else legitimate nothing at all given the fact value distinction, but the point being addressed here is how people act as if they do. Thus, people literally feel the need to root themselves today and tomorrow in their yesterdays. Recently, such yesterdays have been sought for and found, given that the past can and will sustain countless narratives by women, blacks, regional groupings, various minorities, etc. In these pasts, explanations for current existences and future programs are made. A little further back, and the working classes too sought to root themselves by way of a historically contrived trajectory. Further back still, the bourgeoisie found its genealogy and began to construct its history for itself and others. In that sense, all classes, groups, write their collective autobiographies. History is the way people create, in part, their identities. It is far more than a slot in the school academics curriculum, though we can see how what goes into each spaces is crucially important for all those variously interested parties. Do we not know this all the time? It is not obvious that such an important legitimating phenomenon as history is rooted in real needs and power. I think it is. Except that when the dominant discourse refers to the constant rewriting of histories, it does so in ways that displace such needs. It muses blandly that each generation rewrites its own history. But the question is how and why? And the arguable answer, alluded to in Orwell, is because power relations produce ideological discourses such as history as knowledge, which are necessary for all involved in terms of conflicting legitimation exercises. Let us conclude the discussion of what history is in theory. I have argued that history is composed of epistemology, methodology, and ideology. Epistemology shows we can never really know the past, that the gap between the past and history, historiography, is an ontological one. That is, it is the very nature of things such that no amount of epistemological effort can bridge it. Historians have devised ways of working to cut down the influence of the interpreting historian by developing rigorous methods, which they have then tried variously to universalize, so that if everyone practiced them, then a heartland of skills concepts, routines, and procedures could reach towards objectivity, but there are many methodologies. And so called heartland concepts are of recent and partial construction, and I have argued that the differences that we see are there because history is basically a contested discourse, an embattled terrain wherein people, classes, groups autobiographically construct interpretations of the past, literally to please themselves. There is no definitive history outside these pressures. Any temporary consensus only being reached where dominant voices can silence others, either by overt power or covert incorporation. In the end, history is theory, and theory is ideological, and ideology just is material interests. Ideology seeps into every nook and cranny of history, including the everyday practices of making histories in those institutions predominantly set aside in our social formation for that purpose, especially universities. Let us now look at history as that sort of practice.